This is Freshly Squeezed True Crime, a Florida-only true crime podcast. I'm Suhaili, and before we get to this week's juicy episode, I ask you to visit the website at fstcpodcast.com, where you'll find all of our social media platforms as well as the newest episodes. And also, find us on YouTube, where we'd like you to follow us, subscribe, share it, do all the things. So, pour yourself a tall glass of orange juice, and let me tell you a story. Happy Halloween! Enjoy this bonus episode. The Sunshine Skyway Bridge is considered the flagship bridge to Florida and the gateway to Tampa Bay. It is a 4-lane bridge with a total length of 5.5 miles, a main span of 1,200 feet, and a total height of 430 feet. An aesthetic and engineering marvel, the iconic cables of the bridge are painted yellow in a tribute to Florida's moniker as the Sunshine State. In 2019, the bridge was outfitted with more than 1,800 LED fixtures to color the underside of the main span and the piling for a length of 1.7 miles. This lighting allowed the bridge to be decorated for holidays and other observances. Approximately 50,500 vehicles cross the bridge per day. It is a toll bridge with a one-way rate of $1.75. But how did we get here? Well, in 1924, Jim Foley, a realtor, and his partner, Charles R. Carter, joined with James E. Busey, that's a lot of people, an attorney to create the Beeline Ferry Company. The service was started on March 7, 1927, and originally had 2 ferries. The ferry crossed from the ends of Bay Vista Park in St. Petersburg and went to Piney Point on the other side of the bay. A physiotherapist from St. Petersburg named Herman Simons proposed building a, quote, high-level suspension bridge in 1926. Sometime during 1927, Simmons received congressional approval and a permit from the U.S. War Department, which is now called the Department of Defense, to build a bridge, but efforts were put on hold due to the Great Depression. In 1929, the Florida legislature gave the Beeline Ferry a 50-year franchise to operate a service between Pinellas and Manatee counties. The service gradually expanded during the 1930s, and by the end of the decade, Beeline operated 4 boats, which departed every 30 minutes in the winter and every 45 minutes in the summer during daylight hours, and of course, weather permitting. During its last full year of operation in 1941, Beeline carried almost 100,000 vehicles and thousands of passengers. However, ferries stopped running in 1942 when many employees were called to serve, and the boats were converted to military use as part of the World War II war effort. In 1944, the St. Petersburg Port Authority bought the franchise from Beeline and resumed ferry service, albeit on a smaller scale, until the end of the war. Regular ferry service would continue until the Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened a decade later. Construction bids began to be accepted in July 1950, and construction started on October 19, 1950, with 544 workers. Staging areas for the construction of the bridge were established at both crossing sites. An entire concrete factory was established near Piney Point, while prefabricated concrete parts were delivered via barge from a site in Tampa where they were made. 44.1 million cubic yards of material were dredged as part of building the causeways for the bridge. To physically build the bridge, 12.1 million pounds of structural steel, 8.5 million pounds of rebar, and 115 cubic yards of concrete were used. The original 2-lane bridge opened to traffic on September 6, 1954. At the time of the bridge's opening, it was among the longest bridges on Earth, and it was the longest continuous bridge in the United States. The bridge represented the fulfillment of a quarter-century of dreams deferred. In 1969, a second 2-lane span was built beside the original to ease traffic and bring the bridge up to the interstate highway standards. The Blackthorn was a 180-foot buoy tender that was docked in Tampa Bay in early 1980. On January 28th, the ship was ready to set sail out of the bay. When attempting to leave the port that night, the Blackthorn found itself in a horrific accident. The ship collided with the tanker, the Capricorn, as it was floating in the bay. A lapse in communication would lead to a horrible outcome. The ships were unable to make contact via radio to signal that they were passing. The Blackthorn's captain had left the deck and left the junior captain in charge. When the Capricorn blew two short whistles to communicate that they needed to pass the starboard to starboard, the inexperienced officer didn't understand. The Blackthorn attempted to evade the oncoming Capricorn, however, the two ships collided. The impact, miraculously, didn't cause much damage. However, the Capricorn's anchor got stuck in the side of the Blackthorn's hull. The ships began to pull apart, and the Capricorn pulled the Blackthorn over until she capsized. 23 Coast Guard officers lost their lives that night in the waters near the Sunshine Skyway. One of them was 18-year-old apprentice William Flores. He tossed life jackets to the other seamen, trying to save their lives. Sadly, Flores himself sank to the depths of the Tampa Bay with the ship. Just a few months later, the southbound span, which opened in 1971, of the original bridge was destroyed on the morning of May 9, 1980, when the 606-foot freighter MV Summit Venture collided with a support column during a sudden squall, causing the catastrophic failure of over 1,200 feet of span at 7:38 a.m. Several vehicles were at the top of the bridge when almost a quarter mile of roadway fell away beneath them, while others drove off the edge, either because the drivers didn't notice the collapse in the driving rain or could not stop quickly enough in the wet conditions. In all, 6 cars, a truck, and a Greyhound bus carrying 22 college students traveling to Miami plummeted 150 feet into Tampa Bay, resulting in 35 deaths. A few drivers, including former Major League Baseball player Granny Hamner, were able to stop their vehicles before reaching the gap. And as seen in many photographs of the aftermath, a Buick Skylark driven by local car dealer Richard Hornbuckle skidded to a halt just 2 feet from the abyss. Michael Betts and Robert Raiola, 2 Florida Department of Transportation drivers, were already planning on being at the bridge that day. This was Betts' 5th day on the job. Raiola was training him. Both were eating breakfast at the Bunny Hut where the call came in. Upon arrival, the FDOT drivers worked with Eckerd College's search and rescue divers to retrieve bodies from the water. Betts and Raiola made 2 dives down the upside-down Greyhound bus where all aboard had passed away, 22 passengers and the driver, when another storm started moving in. Betts and Raiola were unable to retrieve all of the bodies trapped in the bus. Only 18 bodies were recovered on that day. 7 were recovered the next day by other divers. Bodies were ferried to Andrew Potter Pier, also known as Potter's Pier, on the southwest corner of Mullet Key. Here, they were processed until being transferred to the coroner's office in Largo. Visitors to the park speculate that some of the ghosts seen may be those drowned in this horrific accident. In the waters below, several small official and private boats and transportation department diving teams arrived soon after the intense but narrow squall line cleared the vicinity. However, the frantic rescue effort became a recovery operation as only victims' bodies were found. The only survivor of the fall was Wesley McIntyre, whose Ford Courier pickup truck had bounced off the hull of the Summit Venture and into the water. The truck sank to the shallow bottom of the bay, but McIntyre managed to escape and swim to the surface, where he was quickly pulled to safety aboard the freighter. John Lairell, the veteran harbor pilot who was steering the ship at the time of the accident, was cleared of all wrongdoing by both state grand jury and Coast Guard investigation. The investigations concluded that the inbound freighter had been in the process of maneuvering in the narrow channel under the center of the bridge when a microburst containing sudden torrential rains and 70-mile-per-hour cut visibility to near zero and temporarily rendered the ship's radar useless. Lairell put the ship's engine into full reverse and ordered the emergency dropping of the anchor when he realized that the freighter had left the channel. But the forward momentum of the 20,000-ton ship, along with strong winds from astern, pushed the bow into the support beams to the right of the shipping lane. While the main support pier nearest the channel withstood the strike with only minor damage, a secondary support pier just to the south was not designed to withstand such an impact and failed catastrophically, causing the entire center of the southbound span to collapse. Soon after the disaster, the undamaged northbound span was converted back to a two-way bridge while the state of Florida considered proposals for the replacement. Governor Bob Graham's idea to build a signature cable-stayed bridge with a span that would be 50% wider than that of the old Skyway won out over the other proposals. In addition to a wider shipping lane, the channel would be marked by a quarter-mile-long series of large concrete barriers, and the support piers would be protected by massive concrete bumpers called dolphins. Construction began in January 1983, with the pounding of pilings for the foundation, and work on the main piers began the following September. The complicated project was delayed several times by bad weather and various difficulties in construction, and the planned opening was pushed back several times. The bridge was dedicated on February 7, 1987. Finally, the opening ceremony was set for April 30, 1987. However, on April 29th, at about 3:30 p.m., the new bridge's protective bumpers were hit head-on by the Deliverance, a 74-foot shrimp boat. The bumper sustained minor damage, and the bridge was not affected, but the vessel took on water and was towed out of the channel into shallow waters, where it promptly sank. The opening ceremonies proceeded as scheduled. In 1990, the Florida Department of Transportation awarded a bid to Hardaway Company to demolish all steel and concrete sections of the older Sunshine Skyway spans. The scope of the project required that all underwater piles and piers, surface roadway, girders, and beams to be dismantled. Special care had to be taken in removing underwater bridge elements near the channel, and the central portion of the original bridge had to be removed in one piece to minimize closure of the only approach to the busy port of Tampa. Most of the concrete material was used to create an artificial reef near the southbound approach of the old bridge, which was converted into a long pier for the newly created Skyway Fishing Pier skate park. Unused approaches to the original spans were demolished in 2008. Wesley McIntyre, the only motorist survivor of the collapse, was the last person to drive over the intact original span before it was demolished. Accompanied by his wife, he stopped at the apex of the bridge and dropped 35 white carnations into the water, one for each person who died in the disaster. Now, let's talk about suicides. At least 316 people have died by suicide jumping from the bridge or its predecessors into the waters of Tampa Bay. An estimated 48 others have survived. Many other missing persons are suspected of having jumped from the bridge, but their deaths could not be confirmed as no bodies were recovered. In response to the high number of suicide attempts from the bridge, Florida installed 6 crisis hotline phones along the center span in 1999 and began 24-hour patrols. As of 2003, the call center at the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay received 18 calls from potential jumpers, all of whom survived, according to a 2003 St. Pete Times report. However, the bridge saw an average of 1 jump per month, reaching a record high of 18 suicides in 2018. In 2006, a feature film called Lauren Cass was released, which depicted a suicide jump off the Sunshine. 2 years later, Sean Michael Davis of Rhino Productions was inspired by his haunting experience witnessing a woman get out of her car and immediately jump off the bridge before anyone could intervene to create a not-for-profit film titled Skyway Down. His objectives were to deter other potential jumpers by, quote, punching them in the face, with interviews with survivors and family members to give them, quote, hope and to try to de-glorify the romanticism of the bridge, in part by informing those who have moles a leap to know about the bloody, battered aftermath. In 2020, the Florida Department of Transportation installed the Skyway Vertical Net, a vertical fence designed to deter suicide attempts. The fencing was placed atop the bridge's waist-high concrete barriers, creating an overall, quote, wall almost 11 feet tall, which runs 1.5 miles along the highest portions of the bridge. The fence is designed to dissuade potential jumpers, or at least slow them down long enough that law enforcement officers can reach them. The number of jumpers has been drastically reduced since the project's completion in June 2021, with only 5 reported over the ensuing 29 months. In one of the deadliest bridges in the United States for suicides, and the number keeps rising, with all the death and heartbreak, it's no surprise that the Sunshine Skyway Bridge is known as one of the most haunted spots in Tampa. Some who have fished from nearby piers made from remaining parts of the old bridge supposedly claim to feel the breeze and smell distinct whiff of gasoline coming from the ill-fated Greyhound bus that fell into the waters on that tragic day. A story from the 1990 details an account of 2 witnesses who were on the fishing pier one morning. According to one of them, the phantom bus passed right by with all the passengers on board bolted forward, with looks of terror on their faces. He was then looking at the window at the back of the bus when a passenger turned around and waved at him smiling. There is also a hair-raising legend connected to the bus when it was fished out of Tampa Bay. Greyhounds salvaged whatever parts they could from it and installed them in other buses. It's safe to say the ghost didn't think it was a good taste, considering every bus installed with one of those parts allegedly burned in flames. Fucking yikes. There have also been alleged reports of unexplained light phenomena in the water under the bridge, but something else haunts the Skyway, something far more unsettling. Toll booth workers and motorists have claimed to see a woman with blonde hair standing in the middle of the road around midnight. Others say she hitchhikes, but as if this wasn't unusual enough, walking on the bridge is illegal. So naturally, drivers would park on the side, thinking she was a jumper. However, she would vanish as soon as they got out of the car. Other accounts explain that this feminine spirit would in fact accept a ride from anyone daring to offer. She appears nervous and fidgety once she's in the car, eager to get to the other side of the bridge. It's not too long after when the driver will turn their head and she's gone. This story was submitted via email. I'm a witness to the hitchhiker. I have seen her several times. Every time she's jogging along the causeway, except for the one time when I was at the top of the bridge in 1998. I was looking down into the water when the hitchhiker jogged right past me, said, "Don't do it," and then went on her way from the slope, disappearing from view. She is fairly tall, slender girl with blonde hair down to her shoulders. She is wearing a hooded shirt that night. I didn't know she was a spirit until that night. I saw her several times jogging along the causeway after that, but it's been a few years since I've seen her. I really don't travel that way. Not since '02. Most motorists pull over when they see the distraught young lady hitchhiking at the base of the Skyway Bridge. Obviously in distress, the driver often abandons his or her mantra of never picking up a stranger and decides to give the troubled girl a ride. After all, it's a foggy night, and the 15-mile span of bridge is an awfully long way for a young lady to walk alone. The mysterious blonde hops into the vehicle with ease, usually taking the seat in the back. At first, she makes casual conversation, commenting on mundane observations, such as the misty weather and the dangers associated with it. After all, wasn't it a morning like this that triggered the mass tragedy in 1980, when a freighter hit the bridge and caused the 35 deaths? As the vehicle gets closer to the top of the bridge, the woman becomes more and more distraught, her voice transitioning from calm to anxious to finally earnest. "Do you believe in Jesus?" she asks. "Do you believe in God?" Finally, just as her presence is beginning to disturb the driver to shit, a point of wanting to pull over, they look back to the silence of the woman and she's gone, vanished into thin air. Then, of course, there are crimes that occur on this bridge. Most recently, 34-year-old Alex Martinez was found in Plant City by the U.S. Marshals. He was arrested nearly 2 years after 26-year-old Domenico Primavera Ibaria Hernandez was killed at the Sunshine Skyway South Fishing Pier. Detectives say Ibaria Hernandez met Martinez to buy a large quantity of marijuana on October 14, 2022. A 911 call was made at 5:16 p.m. to the Manatee County Sheriff's Office referencing a shooting with injuries South Sunshine Skyway Fishing Pier. During the transaction, deputies say multiple gunshots were fired to include left chest, right cheek, left collarbone, under the right armpit, and one to the back of the head with a 9mm handgun. Iberia Hernandez was found dead inside a parked car. Martinez was served with a warrant for felony murder with a firearm and charged with failure to obey written promise to appear and providing false law enforcement to law enforcement officers, according to the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. This case is ongoing, with a future court hearing set for November the 20th. But the most disturbing case is that of Phoebe Jonchuck. On the morning of January 8th, 2015, at 12:09 a.m., Officer William Vickers of the St. Petersburg Police Department witnessed John Jonchuck exit his vehicle, enter the right rear passenger seat, and grab a child, his daughter. This garbage carried the child in his arms to the side of the bridge and intentionally dropped the child into the water. He then entered his car and fled the scene. He was apprehended and taken to the Pinellas County Jail, where he was charged with murder in the first degree, aggravated fleeing and eluding a police officer, and aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer. On April 16, 2019, the jury found this piece of shit guilty of murder in the first degree and the death of his 5-year-old daughter Phoebe Jonchuck, despite arguments from his attorneys that he was insane and thought his actions would actually save her. Jurors in Clearwater deliberated for about 7 hours over 2 days before convicting Jonchuck, whom prosecutors portrayed as a vengeful man who planned to kill his daughter to keep her away from her mother and grandmother. No one from Jonchuck's family was in the courtroom when the verdict was announced, and no friends nor relatives spoke on behalf of Phoebe or her father before the sentencing. No one disputed that Jonchuck, 29, at the time of sentencing, dropped his daughter Phoebe 62 feet into Tampa Bay in January of 2015, and that he had a long history of mental health problems. But prosecutors claimed his actions were premeditated. Assistant State Attorney Paul Boland told jurors that Jonchuck was motivated by anger over worries that Phoebe's mother was going to take the girl away from him and his own mother's doting attention to her granddaughter when she had been inattentive to him growing up. Unbelievable. It was rage that drove him to it on top of that bridge, Boland said. Did he know what he was doing? And did he know it was wrong? The answer is clearly yes. But Assistant Public Defender Jessica Manuel told jurors Jonchuck loved Phoebe more than anything else in the world, and that there is no evidence he acted out of unbridled anger. His illusions led him to believe Phoebe was possessed, and that the Archangel Michael was coming, Manuel said. He poured salt outside her window to keep spirits away. At the moment he threw her off the bridge, he thought he was protecting his daughter. It will never make sense because it's insanity. 12 hours before Phoebe's death, Jonchuck's divorce lawyer, Genevieve Torres, called a state child protective hotline, fearing for the girl's safety, authorities said. Torres told the Department of Children and Families operator that Jonchuck had driven to 3 churches in his pajamas with Phoebe in tow that morning, called Torres, quote, God, and asked her to translate his stepmother's century-old Swedish Bible, which he carried and had become obsessed with. Jonchuck was also paranoid that Phoebe wasn't his child, Torres said. But the operator thought that the attorney was more worried about Jonchuck's safety than the girl's and did not report the call to authorities. Just after midnight the next day, Jonchuck's PT Cruiser raced past Officer William Vickers, who was heading home from a shift in his patrol car. He started following Jonchuck, but never got close enough to read his license plate and didn't know Phoebe was inside. As they reached the bridge's crest, Jonchuck stopped and got out. Vickers, fearing an ambush, stopped him, pulled his gun, and yelled Jonchuck to show his hands. He saw no weapon. Jonchuck yelled at the officer, You have no free will. He grabbed Phoebe from the back seat, held her over the side momentarily, and then just dropped her, according to police accounts. Jonchuck drove off but was soon arrested. Victor scrambled down a ladder to a dock below the bridge but couldn't see Phoebe in the dark water. A marine rescue boat was summoned and her body was found hours later. At first appearance before a judge, Jonchuck said, quote, I want to leave it in God's hands, when asked whether he wanted an attorney. I'm pretty sure God is not going to be representing you in this case, replied the judge. Fucking sassy pants, that judge. By age 5, Phoebe Jonchuck already had a significant history with Florida Child Protective Authorities. Her father was habitually violent with his domestic partners and had been accused of, quote, smacking his daughter in the face. Phoebe's mother, according to reports to the agency, was a meth user who had been charged with cruelty to another child in 2008. DCF contact with Phoebe's family on April 2012 was its first in Tampa. All child protective probes are conducted by the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office under contract with DCF. The hotline called alleged that Jonchuck used, quote, crystal meth, had choked Phoebe's mother, and had locked the then toddler in the bedroom, where powerful pharmaceutical medication was located. At the time that report was received, unspecified extended family members had already been the subject of 7 prior calls to DCF beginning in 1997 and ending in 2012. Jonchuck already had an arrest history that included aggravated assault with a weapon, multiple charges of domestic battery and larceny. Kerr, the girl's mother, had been charged with child abuse. A former landlord told an investigator he'd found, quote, drug paraphernalia at the couple's home and had found doors kicked in on several occasions and had been forced to replace windows that had been smashed by the couple. He described Jonchuck and Kerr's behavior as, quote, very erratic. Still, at the time, investigators closed the case. They had concluded that the risk to Phoebe was low because Jonchuck and Kerr had moved to a new home, and, quote, the new home was observed to be free and clear of any environmental hazards. A local church was helping with the couple as well. Quote, there was no concern for the family, a notation from April 19th of that year stated. Days earlier, the notation said that Jonchuck's psychiatrist had told investigators Jonchuck had missed his domestic violence counseling appointment and had failed to reschedule. DCF received another call in 2013 alleging that Kerr had abused methamphetamines, cocaine, and alcohol, had been hostile, had fallen down when drunk. The mother, the report said, was violent with Jonchuck and had attacked him with a box cutter. There is a problem with Phoebe not being bathed, the report adding. There are some concerns regarding the mother having adequate food in the home. And, though the investigation was closed, with verified findings that Phoebe was at some risk because of the ongoing violence between her parents, investigators took no actions on her behalf. The hotline received another report 1 month prior to the murder, saying that Jonchuck, who had custody of Phoebe, did not have a stable home and was moving in between relatives. The relatives, the report alleged, were alcoholics. Kerr, 29, alleged to struggle with drugs and mental health problems, the report said, and was living once again with the man who beat her up. DCF received its final report on Phoebe 1 day before her death. It came in at 2:45 p.m. and said that Jonchuck was, quote, driving all over town in his pajamas with Phoebe in the car. The father seemed depressed and delusional, the report added. Kerr, the report said, was unstable and living with a violent boyfriend. Jonchuck was hiding his daughter from both her mom and her school. The report apparently originated with a Tampa family court lawyer whom reports said Jonchuck had visited Wednesday as part of his dispute with Phoebe's mom. A record of the report does not indicate any action has been taken by Thursday morning when Jonchuck's odyssey ended near the Skyway Bridge. Psychologist Peter Bernson admitted in court that Jonchuck had severe mental illness, but didn't believe that was the driving force behind Phoebe's death, that he believes was a culmination of conflicts that had been building in his life. Some of those factors involved Phoebe, her mother, and the issues of custody. He was a teapot boiling until it finally went off. Although he had severe mental health, he could still tell right from wrong. Furthermore, if the voices told him to kill himself and his daughter, he should have died too. He was automatically sentenced to life in prison and is inmate Y90393 at Santa Rosa, CI. This episode was squeezed to perfection. First Few Squeezed is hosted and written by me, Sue Haley, and executive produced by Ebony. Still thirsty and need more? Visit us at fstcpodcast.com for links to all our social media handles, including YouTube. Want to keep the juice flowing? Make a donation by buying us a glass. And as always, cheers.